Hello, everyone. I'm Annie Margaret, and I'm currently a instructor at the Atlas Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder, where our students receive a degree in creative technology and design. And today I'm going to talk to you about empathy and technology. And you might have noticed that empathy has become a buzzword, specifically in business. So if you Google the word empathy, you get results, things like the power of empathy in business, how to use customer empathy to get repeat business. There's even starting to be a discussion of the empathy economy and what that means. Articles about the ROI of empathy. And so it leads me to question if empathy has just become synonymous with money, or that this the way in which it's become a buzzword has caused it to lose some meaning. And so when we think about what we actually mean when we use that word, modern psychologists define empathy as having three parts. So there's cognitive empathy, which I think is often what businesses are talking about, which is just identifying what others are feeling, identifying what your customers are feeling in that case. Emotional empathy, which is actually sharing the emotions of another. I think this is something we often experience where our friends or loved ones are having a hard time and we actually feel what another person is feeling. And then the third aspect is empathic concern. Could be synonymous with compassion or the desire to improve the circumstances of others. And so as we go through if you take this course, or as we go through the video, I really want you to keep in mind the specific language of what we're talking about when we throw that word around, empathy. And so a little background on the animal aspect of empathy. So even rats got it. So in this study, they have a rat trapped in a narrow plastic tube, and its unrestrained cage mate will work on the latch until it figures out how to spring the trap. And so they suggested that this was because they felt empathic concern for their trapped cage mate. However, people were skeptical and they said, oh no, it's not because they're having empathic concern. It's still totally selfishly motivated and they just want companionship. So now on one side of the box, they had a rat forced to swim in a pool of water. And the other rodent, the other rat, was able to push a latch to free the rat who's stranded in this swimming, treading water situation. And so if it pushed this little lever, it could separate the door, and the swimming rat could come onto dry land. And so within just a couple days, the dry, safe rats were regularly helping their soaking companions out, opening the door and letting them free. And then they tested this even further by pitting chocolate against altruism. So in this experiment, the rats on the dry platform could choose between either freeing their swimming companion who's trapped in the swimming area, or getting access to a tasty chocolate treat. And what they found was that the rodents would choose to help their companions before getting the snack 50 to 80% of the time. And so I tell this story, because it's adorable, and rats are villainized in Disney, even though they're actually wonderful little creatures. And also to show that there is some history of evolution of empathy beyond just humans. And as we think about the evolution of empathy and prosocial behavior, this is what humans do best, right? We are not the strongest. We don't run the fastest or jump the highest or hunt the best, but we are the friendliest primate. We have cooperative communication skills beyond any other animal. And another thing, we'll talk a lot about this in class, if you decide to take empathy and technology, is called the cooperative eye hypothesis. And so if you look at the top picture of an ape, you see that they don't have whites around their eyes, but humans do. And the idea is that we evolved the whites around our eyes so that we could detect each other's eye gaze for cooperation, to tell who we can trust and who we can't. This sort of evolution of prosocial behavior. And there's a lot there. I'm just giving you a little nugget, but we'll talk more about that later. And so, as you know, we evolved in these kind of small, tightly knit communities where the people we saw suffering were right in front of us. And if we contrast that to modern times, by 2050, the number of people living in highly populated cities will be 2/3 of the population. So by 2050, 2/3 of our species will be urban. In the US, 10 times as many 18 to 34-year-olds live alone now compared to the 50s. And so we will discuss what happens when we take our evolved empathic environment and scale that to our modern living circumstances, where we are both surrounded by people and also living alone. And so in this study done by Sarah Conrath, they studied the empathy of people over 30 years. So this was done with college students, and they found that the average person in 2009 was less empathic than 75% of people in 1979. And so you might say, wow, this is bad. Sounds really bad. This can't be good for humanity. But again, think about, what do we mean when we say less empathic? What does that mean actually? And so in this study, it was based on questions like, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than I am. That might be emotional empathy. I try to look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision. That's probably cognitive empathy, trying to understand how other people are feeling. So if we think about the fact that we're less empathic than we were 30, 40 years ago, this comes in the media to a place where we hear about, oh, there's an empathy deficit, right? The people are less empathic than they used to be. This is a problem. We have this huge empathy deficit. And again, what does it mean when we say that? Are we talking about a deficit in cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, or empathic concern or compassion? And so if we think about emotional empathy as potentially where the deficit is happening, the emotional empathy is when we are exposed to other people suffering and then we become wounded as well. Now we are also suffering. We are incapacitated by our feelings of sharing that suffering with the person we're observing. And now, through these devices we keep in our pockets at arm's reach all the time, we have access to the pain and suffering of almost the entire world at any moment. And if we felt true emotional empathy for every instance of suffering that we see on the internet and social media, you can see where this could easily lead to empathic overwhelm. And we do see this with some people just being paralyzed by the pain and suffering we observe, because we're not evolved to handle the volume of tragedy that we can access. So if we revisit this statistic in the sort of the light of modern technology and the amount of suffering we can access, perhaps we can see this differently. I wonder what would happen, what the results would be if they also did a similar study of tolerance. Right? Are we less empathic, less emotionally upset by the suffering of others because we have to be, and perhaps more tolerant of different lifestyles, different ideologies? Who knows? I don't know, but it's something we'll talk about in class, and we'll discuss this question: can we revive empathy? And more importantly, should we? And I think it's often assumed that we should, but it's worth discussing. We'll discuss some critiques of the idea that empathy will save us. Paul Bloom wrote a book called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion, and sort of argues that perhaps this intense emotional empathy that leads to empathic overwhelm is not the best way forward. There's other problems with empathy. So in the class, we'll discuss tribalism and tribal psychology, which is this pattern of attitudes and behaviors that we adopt when we identify with our tribes. And empathy tends to favor our tribal in-groups. So we have people that we can identify based on ethnicity or race, or even just what sports team they like or their religion, right? Where we identify this in group and then we favor them. Our empathy is more distributed toward those people. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. This is just part of how human psychology works. And so in this interesting study, they had people wearing jerseys, so soccer jerseys of Manchester United versus Liverpool. And if you're not familiar, this is a very intense rivalry. And so they would have the research subjects write an essay about what Manchester United means to them. Right. So they thought that that was the experiment. So they're writing the essay and then they leave. And as they're leaving the place where the experiment was done, there's a person on the sidewalk with a twisted ankle wearing a Manchester United jersey or a Liverpool jersey. And so when the person is wearing the Manchester United jersey, 90% of the Manchester United fans stop to help. And when the person's wearing a Liverpool jersey, only 30% stop to help. Right. So this is just evidence of how we favor our in-group. And so if your in-group is Manchester United, then you're going to stop and help that person. But what the really interesting part is, this can be changed by priming. So if instead of having them write the essay about how much they love Manchester United, they wrote the essay about how much they love soccer, these numbers change dramatically. And now everyone is much more likely to stop and help the person because, oh, you're a soccer fan and I'm a soccer fan and it doesn't matter what team, right? So just what we're thinking about, how we're choosing to identify our in-group can change our willingness to offer empathic concern, to be compassionate. Okay. And so as we think about tribalism, right, this is where we're in these kind of little groups. And so if we hear only our in-group perspective, this creates both a moral and an epistemic problem, how we obtain knowledge. And so moral and political bubbles are also epistemic bubbles. And we can get to this place where everyone outside the bubble is biased and lying and irrational, and they're disgusting. And we see this in our modern political climate, I think, somewhat. And this brings me to another topic that we'll spend a lot of time on in the course, many days on this, but the polarization and tribalism through media. So through our screens, anonymity, virality, all of the things that play into this, and how this ecosystem, this bizarre technological ecosystem, affects our ability, our capacity for compassion. Okay, so polarization, another one of these words like empathy, that the media loves to just throw around. Oh, we're more polarized than ever. Okay, what does that actually mean? So we'll talk about this in class. There's ideological polarization, which is how different people are in various respects. So you give some statement like, the best way to ensure peace is through military strength. And people can say agree, and that's an ideology. And then people can say that they agree or disagree. And so I think there is an argument to be made that ideological polarization is actually a good thing, right? Ideological diversity is good for teams. It's good for decision making. And when this becomes problematic is when it moves into affective polarization. And so this is how warm or cold, how favorable or unfavorable people feel about other people, organizations, institutions. And this becomes a crisis of affective polarization when we extend our disdain or distrust of an institution or ideology. So we say, oh, I don't like the National Science Foundation. I don't trust them. And when that transitions to, and I don't like you and I don't trust you because you are a scientist, this is where we get the crisis of affective polarization, where we're now extending this to the individuals that are associated with that institution or ideology. Okay, and so when we study the virality and spread of information online, what we find is that the emotion that travels the farthest is rage. Stories that are most likely to be shared are those that evoke anger because it's a high valence emotion, right? It calls us to action. We're fired up. So we're more likely to share that information, retweet, whatever. And so in this digital environment, we end up in this place where the first thing that we learn about someone online is often the most horrific thing they've ever said, the most rage-inducing tweet they've ever tweeted, whatever that is. That's often the first thing we find out about that person, which is very different than our evolved environment where we lived with these people and developed relationships. And then if they said something horrible, it's kind of too late because you already like them. You already care about them. You're already invested. Okay, and so throughout the course, I'm going to encourage you to think about empathy as a finite resource. So we'll do activities around budgeting your empathy. So thinking about your emotions as resources. Where are you spending them? Who are you giving them to? And is that consensual? Is it a choice that you're making, or is it being taken from you by buzzwording from your phone? And every time that happens, you're just giving it away. So really thinking about that as your resource. We'll also talk about the plasticity of empathy. So in the early 20th century, psychologists started studying empathy. And this was, in the era of testing trends. And so they devised dozens and dozens of assessments and to see if we could grow empathy. In 1990, the term emotional intelligence was coined. And along with a belief that emotional intelligence could be developed through practice. We'll talk about the nervous system neuroplasticity, meaning that our minds can change. The connections in our minds can change through various practices, which can lead us to be more compassionate. And so if empathy were fixed, it means that whenever we fail to empathize, it's just because we've hit the limits of our circuitry. But we can grow our empathy, or grow our compassion, rather, to use specific language. And there's studies on this by Carol Dweck that basically show that if you are a mobilist and you believe that your compassion can grow, it will. And if you have a fixist mentality, believing that you cannot change how compassionate you are, then you can't change it. And so we'll talk about this sort of growth mindset as it relates to compassion, and we'll do a variety of practices that I'll help facilitate, and you can pick and choose what works for you, take and leave whatever works. And some of those are loving kindness meditation, perspective taking, active listening. And we'll also review primary literature of the specific practices that lead to specific outcomes. So often we talk about meditation or mindfulness, and it's just this blanket term for many, many different types of practices that have various specific outcomes. And so we'll talk about that in class and read primary literature to try to help you gain confidence in your ability to find primary literature, to read it and understand it, because you can. You might see this right now and think that looks really intimidating, but we're going to spend a lot of time going step by step through these papers so that you know that whatever piece of information you want to find, whatever you're interested in, you have the ability to think, to read primary literature and to think critically about it, to criticize the experimental design, and to decide to make informed decisions about the literature you're reading. And so there's a whole variety of learning outcomes that you can see here. And we'll talk a lot more. So I've kind of given some of the historical and evolutionary perspective on empathy, but we'll also talk about the relationship to technology. So the design of our technologies, where could they have been designed differently to be more inclusive, less addictive, more human-centered? We'll talk about various design solutions. How would we change social media if what we were optimizing for was compassion rather than engagement? We'll talk about a lot of things. Some of them I talked about today, the evolution of prosocial behavior, empathy deficit, and empathic overwhelm. But then we'll also get into things like the weaponization of empathy through social media, emotional contagion, the empathy economy, and the commodification of our emotions. And so I hope that I'll see you. A little bit about my teaching philosophy. I really believe in freedom and self-directed learning. So I'm just here to facilitate, to help guide you, to maybe point, look here, to help you understand that difficult figure that doesn't make sense. Transparency. I'm going to be clear with you about why I'm assigning what I'm assigning, and then slowing down and creating space for you to reflect on and integrate what you're learning, the practices you're doing, so that can really sink in, rather than this kind of more, faster, more content sort of thing that we can get trapped in. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from the course, it's that your empathy is your resource for you to choose how to spend it. And I'm not here to tell you how to spend it. I'm just here to facilitate, hopefully, your understanding that you have a choice, you have agency in how you spend that. And for more information, you can check me out at anniemargaret.com. Thank you so much for your time. Get sleep, drink water, eat vegetables, and I will see you soon.